Good morning, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about the British poetry, and it is block number 2nd. It is actually related with the ancient classical poets like Milton and Dryden, etc. First of all, we would like to discuss John Milton, who was a great poet of English poetry and was born on 9 December 1608 and died in 8th November 1674. He was a very famous English poet and man of letters and a civil servant for the Commonwealth of England under Oliver Cromwell. He wrote at a time of religious flux and political upheaval and is best known for his epic poem Paradise Lost, written in blank verse. Milton's poetry and prose reflect deep personal convictions, a passion for freedom and self-determination, and the urgent issues and political turbulence of his day. Writing in English, Latin, Greek, and Italian, he achieved international renown within his lifetime, and his celebrated Areopagitica, written in condemnation of pre-publication censorship, is among history's most influential and impassioned defenses of free speech and freedom of the press. So, through the slide, we can very easily come to a conclusion that he was a very famous poet who created his own place in English literature because of his writings and because of his poetry. William Haley's 1796 biography called him the greatest English author, and he remains generally regarded as one of the most important writers in the English language. Though critical reception has oscillated in the centuries since his death, often an account of his republicanism, Samuel Johnson praised Paradise Lost as a poem with respect to design may claim the first place, and with respect to performance, the second among the productions of the human mind. Though he was a Tory and a recipient of royal patronage, described Milton's politics as those of an acrimonious and surely republican. John Milton worldwide is recognized as the greatest English author because of his writings, because of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. He, as a poet, is highly acclaimed in all writers, all the poets of English literature. In Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, he actually exercised the greatest type of English poetry, and because of that poetry, he is known and appreciated everywhere in the world. He is respected in the world critics. Milton's poetry was slow to see the light of day, at least under his name. His first published poem was on Shakespeare, anonymously included in the second folio edition of William Shakespeare. In the midst of the excitement attending the possibility of establishing a new English government, Milton collected his work in 1645 poems. The anonymous edition of Comus was published in 1637, and the publication of Lycidas in 1638. In Justa Adorando, King Naforgo was signed J.M. Otherwise, the 1645 collection was the only poetry of his to see print until Paradise Lost appeared in 1667. Milton, as we have already discussed in first 2-3 slides, that his poetry became very famous actually, and he published so many things. And as a matter of fact, he wrote in all the forms. He wrote masques, and he wrote elegy and pastoral elegies. Then he wrote epics, and he wrote sonnets also. Milton was a greatest sonneter also, and because of his sonnet writing, his particularly devised sonnets are called as Miltonic sonnets. The sonnets which were particularly devised by him are known as Miltonic sonnets. So actually he has become very famous because of his poetry writing and his presentation of the poetic style. The poetic style of Milton, also known as Miltonic verse, Miltonic epic, or Miltonic blank verse. The particular style of Milton, for which he is known in English literature, that is known as Miltonic verse, that is known as Miltonic epic, that is very famous everywhere. And it was highly influential poetic structure popularized by Milton. It was popularized by Milton, that particular style of Milton. Although Milton wrote earlier poetry, his influence is largely grounded in his later poems, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistus. Although Milton was not the first to use blank verse, his use of it was very influential and he became known for the style. When Miltonic verse became popular, Samuel Johnson mocked Milton for inspiring bad blank verse. But he recognized that Milton's verse style was very influential. Poets such as Alexander Pope, whose final incomplete work was intended to be written in the form, and John Keats, who complained that he relied too heavily on Milton, adopted and picked up various aspects of his poetry. In particular, Miltonic blank verse became the standard for those attempting to write English epics for centuries, following the publication of Paradise Lost and his later poetry. So, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained were very famous poetry collections. These were the epics by Milton, and because of them he became very famous. In the Milton's style was earlier criticized, but later on the critics appreciated his style and his use of blank verse. Poets like Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope, and others appreciated the writings and particularly the use of blank verse by Milton very much. So, as a matter of fact, Miltonic style of using blank verse became a standard form of using blank verse in English literature, and later on it was followed for centuries altogether in the coming form of poetry. After Milton, actually, there is a series that is there in our syllabus, particularly in this block number 2, that is Neoclassical Poets. So, Neoclassical Poets actually are, they come in series after Milton, and they were also in some form or the other, they were the followers of the classical poets, they were the followers of Milton, and later on, actually, they developed a new form in English literature that is known as Neoclassical Poets. English poets from 1660 to 1798 are generally known as Neoclassical Poets. They are called so because they had a great respect for classical writers and imitated much from them. Order, correctness, and established rules were carefully observed. Set phrases and regions were commonly used in their poetry. For Neoclassical writers, poetry was an imitation of human life. So as actually I have just introduced in the introduction, these Neoclassical poets were known as Neoclassical poets because they were in some form or the other, they were also some kind of classical poets. They had great respect for the classical poets, their style, their presentation, their poetic forms, correctness, and other rules actually were inspired by the classical poets. Therefore, these poets, the group of these poets was called as Neoclassical Poets. These Neoclassical Poets actually, they had an imitation from human life and they followed the standards and the performance of the classical poets. John Dryden is a very famous poet of his time. Dryden wrote a great allegorical satire named Absalom and Achitophel. In this poem, he had used the biblical story in order to attack the politicians of his time. Another satire is Macfleckcone, which attacks a rival poet named Shadwell. Dryden had a good command of heroic couplets through which he could write biting satires. The Ode for Saint Cecilia's Day and Alexander's Feast are his best short poems. During the later years of his life, Dryden translated many classical works of great writers from Greek and Latin. So, John Dryden was a very famous name of Neoclassical poetry, and Dryden actually wrote so many writings in which Absalom and Achitophel was very famous satirical creation by John Dryden, and in this actually he used a biblical story in order to attack on the politicians of his time, And another form of satire was Macflacone, who was actually, which was a kind of attack on a rival poet named Shadwell. So through these, both of the satires, actually, Dryden tried to establish his form of writing in English literature. And actually, in poetry also, he was very famous. Sandford's and Cecilia's Day and Alexander's Feast are his best known poems in English literature. So actually, Dryden also became very famous in English literature because of his writings, and he was a very well-known name in the form of neoclassical poets. Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, after John Dryden become on Alexander Pope, he was also a very well-known poem in English literature, and he, another famous satirical poet of the 18th century. Though Pope was physically weak because of his long illness, he wrote essay on criticism while he was still young. The book contains some remarkable expressions. In his delightful poem, The Rape of the Lock, he uses a trivial subject matter and treats it significantly. In his satirical poem, The Dunciad, Pope laughs at the poor poets who are writing for their living. He sometimes has misused his genius by attacking the individual in his poems, which now seem of little importance. His later poems are the Essay on Man and 4 moral essays. The first one is somewhat philosophical. Like Dryden, he also translated some classical works of Homer. Alexander Pope, who is another satirical poet of 18th century, he was also a very famous poet of this neoclassical field. And he wrote particularly essay on criticism while he was very young, actually. And this book became very, very popular among all the neoclassical poets. And his another poem that is a trend-setting work of the neoclassical period, that is known as The Rape of the Lock, that is one of the beautiful creations of English literature particularly. And Alexander Pope used his highest wisdom in order to create that, The Rape of the Lock. Later on, in a satirical poem, The Dunciad, that was also a very famous kind of satire, where actually he creates his own atmosphere, and then actually he laughs on the poor poets. So this is how actually Alexander Pope created beautiful creations in order to make the neoclassical poets very famous. And along with Dryden, he was also a very famous poet of neoclassical poetry, who made neoclassical poetry very famous because of his works. Here it will be apt to mention that Essay on Criticism is known as the manifesto. Essay on Criticism is known as a manifesto of the neoclassical poetry, of the neoclassical poets. And his other book, The Rape of the Lock, that is a mock poem, mock heroic poem, that is a trend-setting work by Alexander Pope. Both of the questions may be very important for all of you. Now, let us come on John Dryden. Now we will see the description of John Dryden in detail. John Dryden, who was born on 19th August 1631 and died on 12th May 17th century, was an English poet, literary critic, translator, and playwright, who was made poet laureate in 1668. He is seen as dominating the literary life of Restoration England to such a point that the period came to be known in literary circles as the age of Dryden. Walter Scott called him Glorious John. Walter Scott called him Glorious John. What Dryden achieved in his poetry was neither the emotional excitement of the early 19th century romantics nor the intellectual complexities of the metaphysicals. His subject matter was often factual, and he aimed at expressing his thoughts in the most precise and concentrated manner. Although he uses formal structures such as heroic couplets, he tried to recreate the natural rhythm of his speech, and he knew that different subjects need different kinds of verse. In his preface to Religio Laici, he says that the expressions of a poem designed purely for instruction ought to be plain and natural, yet majestic. The florid, elevated, and figurative way is for the passions, for are begotten in the soul by showing the objects out of their true proportion. A man is to be cheated into passion, but to be reasoned into truth. John Dryden, as we have mentioned, actually, he was a very famous poet, literary critic and translator and playwright. He was made poet laureate in 1668. He actually was called as Glorious John by Walter Scott. If we discuss about the metaphysical poetry, he was the leader of metaphysical poetry, and he actually, tried to explore the complexities of metaphysical field, and he created so many famous creations in English that became the milestones in English literature, and because of his poetry, particularly satirical poetry, he became a very famous name. MacFleckone, that we mentioned earlier, actually this is the book that is there in your syllabus, and a very famous creation by Dryden, Spain. MacFleckone, full title MacFleckone, or a satire upon the true blue Protestant poet T.S., is a verse mock heroic satire written by John Dryden. It is a very important point to be noted here, that it is a mock heroic satire poem. It is a poem, but it is a mock heroic satire poem that was written by John Dryden. It is a direct attack on Thomas Shadwell. This is another very important thing to be known, that it is a direct attack on Thomas Shadwell, another prominent poet of the time. It opens with the different kind of, presentations, and some lines. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. This is the line from which it opens. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. So actually, this is the line actually that, as Thomas Gray also says, that all the paths of glory lead but to the grave, written about in 1678, but not polished until 1682. MacFleckone is the outcome of a series of disagreements between Thomas Shadwell and Dryden. Their quarrel blossomed from the following disagreements: their different estimates of the genius of Ben Jonson, the preference of Dryden for comedy of wit and repartee of Shadwell, the chief disciple of Jonson, for humorous comedy, a sharp disagreement over the true purpose of comedy, contention over the value of rhymed plays, and plagiarism. Shadwell fancied himself heir to Ben Jonson and to the variety of comedy which the latter had commonly written. Shadwell's poetry was certainly not of the same standard as Jonson's, and it is possible that Dryden varied of Shadwell's argument that Dryden undervalued Jonson. Shadwell and Dryden were separated not only by literary grounds, but also by political ones, as Shadwell was a Whig, while Dryden was an outspoken supporter of the Stuart monarchy. So this is actually the representation that is there in the book, and we will have a clear picture in the book also, in our study material also. So as a matter of fact, it is a satire. It is a satire on Shadwell. Shadwell also was a poet. So that rivalry, that enmity was there, and because of that actually he satirized his character, the character of Thomas Shadwell, and that is very clearly and very pinpointedly, and in the literary style it is presented here. The poem illustrates Shadwell as the heir of a kingdom of poetic dullness, represented by his association with Richard Fleckone, an earlier poet Dryden disliked. But Dryden does not use belittling techniques to satirize him. So here actually you will come to know that Shadwell is presented as the heir of a kingdom of poetic dullness, means the poets were dull there. No poet was competent enough to write or to create the well-known writings. So in that same posture actually this character of Shadwell has been established there, and he has been made the heir of that kingdom, and this is how he has been represented there. The multiplicity of allusions to the 17th century literary works and to classic Greek and Roman literature with which the poem is riddled demonstrates Dryden's complex approaches to satire, and the fact that he satirizes his own work as well shows his mastery over and respect towards the mock heroic style in which the poem is written. So actually here the poem represents the different satirical points. As a matter of fact, my dear friends, we already discussed it, that it is a poem, particularly it narrates, it has a satirical bent of mind, it is basically satire. So actually it demonstrates the complex approach of satire, and the different complexities are there, and in that style, this is a mock heroic style also in which the poem is written. The poem begins in the tone of an epic masterpiece, presenting Shadwell's defining characteristics as dullness, just as every epic hero has a defining characteristic. Odysseus is cunning, Achilles is wrath, the hero of Spenser's The Fairy Queen is of holiness, while as Satan in Paradise Lost has the defining characteristic of pride. This poem actually begins, as we have discussed already, it has got the, the satirical tone on the character of Shadwell, and it is represented through the different kind of illustrations. Dryden subverts the theme of the defining characteristic by giving Shadwell a negative characteristic as his only virtue. Dryden uses the mock heroic through his use of the heightened language of the epic to treat the trivial subjects, such as poorly written and largely dismissible poetry. The juxtaposition of the lofty style with unexpected nouns such as dullness provides an ironic contrast and makes the satiric point by the obvious disparity. In this, it works at the verbal level, with the language being carried by strong, compelling rhythms and rhymes. So, my dear friends, actually, it is the language of satire, but it goes to the heights of an epic actually. And it is a lofty style here that is used by John Dryden in Macfleckone. And you see, strong and compelling rhythms and rhymes have also been used here in this satire. So all these things put together makes, you see, this satire a very brilliant piece in English literature, a very important piece in English literature. And after discussing John Dryden's Macfleckone, we come to Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, once again, was a very famous poet of neoclassical poetry. He was one of the important poets of neoclassical poetry. As we studied something about Alexander Pope, he was, you see, he invented and created so many things. He narrated so many things in English literature. And his name is respected by many poets and critics in English literature because of his important kind of poetry, the eternal poetry that is created by Alexander Pope. He was born on 21st May 1688 and died on 30th May 1744, my dear friends. And he was a very important 18th century English poet, best known for his satirical verse and for his translation of Homer. He is known for his satirical verse and his translation of Homer. He was very famous for the use of heroic couplet. He is the third most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations after Shakespeare and Tennyson. So as we have discussed already, that he is very well known poet, not only of the neoclassical period, but of all the ages, all the periods of English literature. He was a very important person who created a kind of, you see, important quotations, and those quotations are included in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. Famous and important works of Pope, in which essay on criticism is very much important. An essay on criticism was first anonymously published on 15th May 1711. Pope began writing the poem early in his career and took about 3 years to finish it. At the time the poem was published, the heroic couplet style in which it was written was a moderately new genre of poetry. And Pope's most ambitious work, an essay on criticism, was an attempt to identify and redefine his own positions as a poet and critic. The poem was said to be a response to an ongoing debate on the question of whether poetry should be natural or written according to predetermined artificial rules inherited from the classical past. My dear friends, as we have already suggested, in the beginning that an essay on criticism was a manifesto of this neoclassical poetry. It was a very famous it was a very famous poem written by Alexander Pope, and here actually he uses heroic couplet style, and in which actually he represents those ideas which became the manifesto and the ideal and the style for the coming age that is known as neoclassical age. The poem begins with a discussion of the standard rules that govern poetry by which a critic passes judgment. Pope comments on the classical authors who dealt with such standards and the authority that he believed should be accredited to them. He discusses the laws to which a critic should adhere while critiquing poetry, and points out that critics serve an important function in aiding poets with their works and opposed to the practice of attacking them. So as we were talking just before, that he actually represents those ideas, those ideals, those rules, those parameters, those forms which are very much needed in order to critique a poetry, in order to evaluate a poetry, in order to evaluate a piece of literature. So actually that is why this particular creation of Pope became a very important piece of English literature. The final section of an essay on criticism discusses the moral qualities and virtues inherent in the ideal critic, who Pope claims is also the ideal man. Rape of the Lock. Pope's most famous poem is The Rape of the Lock, first published in 1712, with a revised version published in 1714. And that was a very famous poem once again, because it is a mock epic. It satirizes a high society quarrel between Arabella Fermor, the Belinda of the poem. Very famous character, Belinda, my dear friends, and Lord Peter, who had snipped a lock of hair from her head without her permission. The satirical style is tempered, however, by a genuine and almost interest in that particular society of 18th century. So Rape of the Lock is also a very famous poetry written by Alexander Pope, my dear friends. And next is an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. The epistle is also a satirical poetry written by Alexander Pope and addressed to his friend John Arbuthnot, a physician. It was first published in 1735 and composed in 1734 when Pope learned and that Arbuthnot was dying. Pope described it as a memorable of their friendship. It has been called Pope's most directly autobiographical work, in which he defends his practice in the genre of satire and attacks those who had been his opponents and rivals throughout his career. Both his composition and in publication, the poem had a checkered history in its canonical form. It is composed of 419 lines of heroic couplets. Epistle to Arbuthnot is notable as the source of the phrase damn, with faint phrase used so often it has become a cliché or idiom. Another of its notable lines is who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel. The poem includes character sketches of Joseph Addison and John Harvey. Addison is presented as having great talent that is diminished by fear and jealousy. Harvey is sexually perverse, malicious, and both absurd and dangerous. Both marks the brilliance of the spurious attack by having Arbuthnot exclaim, who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel? In reference to the form of torture called the breaking wheel, by emphasizing friendship, Pope counters his image as an envious and malicious monster, whose satire springs from a being devoid of all natural affections and lacking a heart. It was an efficient and authoritative revenge in this poem and others of the 1730s. Pope presents himself as writing satire not out of ego or misanthropy, but to serve impersonal virtue. So, as a matter of fact, my dear friends, although it was rejected by many critics, contemporary critics of Pope, as a mere lampoon, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot has been described as one of Pope's most striking achievements, a work of authentic power. But tragic and comic as well as great formal ingenuity despite the near chaos from which it emerged. So this is how actually, this was the analysis, my dear friends, of epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, and this was about the block number 2. I think you must have enjoyed. Thank you.